Some passengers thought they'd cut a whale in half. Actually, there's a very, very good reason why there aren't enough lifeboats. Why didn't Jack get on the door as well? You know, there's plenty of room on the door. So maybe the fact that he was so drunk actually helped him. Who knows? Hello and welcome to History Hit. My name's Tim Maltin. I'm one of the leading world experts on the Titanic. And today we're going to be taking a deep dive into the 1997 James Cameron movie, Titanic. You'll get to see some clips of the great film, but you'll also get to learn the truth about what really happened the incredible night the Titanic sank.
Titanic was called the ship of dreams. And it was. It really was.
So this is a wonderful scene. It's Wednesday the 10th of April 1912. Titanic ends up leaving about 15 minutes late, in fact, at 12:15. She was meant to leave at noon. I think that car is probably inspired by a real Renault owned by a first-class passenger called Mr. Carter. And that Renault is in fact still in the hold of Titanic, no doubt rusting away.
Big boat, huh?
Daddy, it's a ship.
Timing was very important for all the passengers on Titanic, and one of the main activities on board actually was taking a sweepstake on how fast the ship would go every day, and they would always bet on where she would be the next day at noon. Now they're inspecting the third class for lice there, and it was actually required that third class and second class be segregated to stop the spread of infectious diseases. So that's extremely accurate, and those gates were not allowed to be opened except in an emergency situation, and that's where we get the stories of third class being trapped below. In fact, as soon as the order was given to abandon ship, those gates were opened, and in fact first class stewards were sent down to help third class up to the boats. Now, here they are waving goodbye. That is very realistic. We've got first-hand accounts of people doing that. In fact, there wasn't a huge crowd on Titanic that day. The really famous ship was her sister ship, the Olympic, which was the twin of Titanic, same size as Titanic. And there was a bigger crowd for her on her maiden voyage. Now here's interesting. You can see as the propellers are turning, it's churning up the mud in the White Star dock. This dock was dug especially for Titanic and Olympic because they were so big. They had to build a new dock to take these enormous vessels, which were twice the size of the previous largest vessels in the world. And in fact, you can see everyone waving there as the ship goes by. In fact, there was a coal strike in 1912, and there were ships laid up along the side. So as Titanic steamed down Southampton water, in fact, another ship was sucked towards the side of Titanic. But quick thinking by Captain Smith actually meant that he pushed the New York away. And ironically, that actually doomed everyone, because had he not been quick thinking on that day, the voyage would have been cancelled and everyone would have survived.
We were steaming west from the coast of Ireland, with nothing out ahead of us but ocean.
There's Captain Smith. He was loved and admired by his men, his crew, as well as by the passengers. They called him the millionaire's captain, and people would change their sailings just to sail with him. He'd never had an accident before, apart from a small accident in the Olympic, where he was racing a Navy vessel and it actually got sucked into the side of the Olympic, but the automatic emergency doors made the ship watertight, so everyone believed the ship was practically unsinkable. These are the huge engines. They're the biggest reciprocating engines ever built. They were 3 decks tall, and they produced 70,000 horsepower. Here are the stokers piling on coal into the furnaces. Titanic burnt 600 tons of coal a day, so it was pretty hot work down there. Many of the stokers did survive because they were used to row the lifeboats away. And there's Titanic's triple screws, as we call it, 3 propellers, the side 2 driven by the steam, and then the central turbine in the middle to be more efficient. And there's Jack. Jack is based on a real-life passenger called Jack Thayer, who actually ended up swimming in the water after the sinking and was one of the few passengers who reported that the Titanic broke in half as she sank, which she did. And here we can see the very good weather, very calm. It was calm all the way from Ireland to the crash site in the North Atlantic. So this is extremely accurate. People were sunbathing on the deck, actually, even though it was April.
21 knots, sir.
Smith liked speed. He liked going very fast, and his officers actually said they used to flush with pride as he would con the ship into New York with only feet to spare between the bow and the stern. And although Titanic wasn't trying to get the blue ribbon, she wasn't fast enough for that. That was more the Lusitania and the Mauretania. They were really built for speed. Titanic was built for size and luxury and reliability. Even so, between Belfast, where Titanic was built, and Southampton, where we just saw her leave, she actually achieved a speed for a period of 24 knots, which is about 26, 27 miles an hour. So she was a very fast ship. And interestingly, when she crashed into the iceberg, she was not actually going at her full speed because they were still lighting up boilers and getting the engines ready. And as you can see here, the engines are settling in well. They were actually performing better than the Olympic on her maiden voyage. So although, as I said earlier, Titanic wasn't going for the blue ribbon, she was in a race. She was racing her sister ship, the Olympic's maiden voyage time. And Titanic was scheduled to get in at Wednesday morning into New York, but I think that Captain Smith and Bruce Ismay slightly hoped that she'd arrive on Tuesday night. Says that as the mist cleared and the sun came up on Wednesday morning, the press in New York would see that Titanic had already arrived at berth 54.
So you've not yet lit the last 4 boilers?
No, I don't see the need. We are making excellent time.
The press knows the size of Titanic. Now I want them to marvel at her speed.
So this is Captain Smith with Bruce Ismay. Bruce Ismay owned the White Star Line, and here really the film is showing Ismay kind of pushing Smith to go faster. In reality, Smith didn't need any encouragement to go faster. He loved going fast, and he knew that all the passengers wanted to go fast. And well, they were in a bit of a race. They were racing the sister ship of Titanic called the Olympic, and her maiden voyage was the year before. And they were already ahead of Olympic's time, and the engines were settling down better. And they were planning to do a full speed trial the next day. So Titanic crashed on Sunday night, sank on Monday morning, and they were actually planning to do a full speed trial the following day. But of course that never happened.
Mr. Andrews, forgive me. I did the sum in my head, and with the number of lifeboats times the capacity you mentioned, forgive me, but it seems that there are not enough for everyone aboard.
About half, actually.
Fascinating. This is Thomas Andrews, who designed and really built the Titanic, and he's chatting with Rose, and Rose is asking about why there aren't enough lifeboats. And actually, there's a very, very good reason why there aren't enough lifeboats, and that's because the Board of Trade knew that in 99 times out of 100, ships would list when they sink. And when a ship lists, which means tips onto one side of the lifeboats cannot be launched. So actually, to have enough lifeboats on a ship for everyone, you have to have enough lifeboats for everyone on each side of the ship, which means you have to have an unbelievably ridiculous number of lifeboats, and most ships sink quite quickly. So there would never be enough time to launch those boats, there'd never be enough trained seamen to go in them. So what the Board of Trade wanted is, instead of lots of unsafe ships piled high with lifeboats, which there will be no time and no manpower to launch, what they wanted was very well subdivided ships like the Titanic, and then those ships would only have to carry enough lifeboats to transship people from a stricken liner to a nearby vessel. And the sea lanes were busy, and there was always nearby vessels. So it's important to understand that lifeboats were not to save everyone. Lifeboats were to transship people from one ship to another.
Here, look at this.
Look at that, would you?
They're a bit warm in the wheel.
Well, if that's what it takes for us to get warm, I'd rather not, if it's all the same with you, all right?
So this is Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee in the Crow's Nest, and they had to give 1 ring for something to the left, 2 rings for something to the right, but if the berg was dead ahead, as in this case, they had to give 3 sharp rings of the bell, and that is the sign that something is coming straight towards them.
Is there anyone there?
Yes, what do you see?
Iceberg, right ahead!
Thank you.
Now Murdoch's in charge at this time, a very skilled navigator, and not Captain Smith at that time, and Murdoch gives the immediate order of hard a starboard to turn the ship to the left. And in fact, you can see the wheel going hard over here, and in fact they did miss the part of the berg that they could see above the water, but that would then bring the stern of Titanic to bear. So what they did was, this is less well reported, but it is accurately in the film, Murdoch then gives the order hard a port, having given the order hard a starboard, and that was the correct order. And then as the Titanic stern swung away from the berg, unfortunately because the berg was very deep, the bow of Titanic actually crashed into the iceberg. And the damage done wasn't actually very big. It was about the size of sort of 2 fireplaces or 2 small tables. But in fact, it was over a 200-foot gap. And Titanic was designed to float with any of her first 4 watertight compartments flooded. But unfortunately, the damage done to the Titanic by the iceberg, including the spur of ice that you couldn't see underneath the water, was into the 5th compartment. And Titanic was simply not designed to have 5 compartments breached all at the same time.
Why are they turning? Is it hard over?
It is, yes, sir, hard over.
Now the iceberg was in fact a white iceberg about 100 feet high, but the lookouts thought it was a black or dark berg because there was a slight haze on the horizon ahead, and as the lookout said, it was a dark mass that came through that haze. Now in fact, when the berg came past the bridge, the lights from the bridge lit it up and you could see that it was in fact completely white. And here we have the berg running along the side of the ship. Passengers felt it differently. Some didn't notice at all. And then here's Andrews feeling it shaking. So those who were awake knew that something was up. Some passengers thought they'd cut a whale in half. Some passengers thought they'd run aground in Newfoundland. But of course, those on the bridge knew that they had had what they thought was a close shave with an iceberg. They didn't at this stage for a minute think that the ship would be doomed. Here are the stokers, the water's coming in. They could actually escape because even though the watertight doors came down, there were escape ladders provided by the White Star Line, and so they were able to get out to safety. So Murdoch is shown there shutting the watertight doors. In fact, they were automatic. As the water came in, it lifted cork floats, which released magnets, and then the heavy doors actually stopped on their own. So here we have the stokers coming out under the doors. In fact, that's not how it happened. They would all have gone up the escape ladders, and the doors would have closed very quickly on impact. There was a fire on the Titanic from Belfast, and it was such a hot fire that actually they couldn't put it out. So the only way to put it out was actually to rake out the hot coal and put it in the furnaces. So they did eventually put the fire out, but it only caused the damage of weeping about a bucket an hour of water. Like a typical bucket, it would take an hour to fill that with water from the damage. So people say that the fire in the hold, contributed to the disaster, but it actually didn't. For example, when the ship stopped, people opened their portholes, and then when they had to go on deck with their life jackets on, they didn't close their windows again. And really, with every porthole that went under the water, it kind of doubled the damage to the Titanic that was actually done by the iceberg.
Sir! Cop paper says they're making 17 knots. Full steam for them, sir.
She's the only one who's responding.
The only one close, sir. says they can be here in 4 hours.
4 hours?
So this is a very dramatic scene where Captain Smith finds out that the eventual rescue ship of the Titanic, called the Carpathia, is actually 4 hours away from them. And Smith thinks at this point that Titanic will only last about an hour and a half. In fact, she lasts to 2 hours, 20 minutes. But that's really the moment where Smith realises they might all end up in the sea and it could be the most incredible catastrophe. Frustratingly for Smith and everyone on the Titanic, there was actually a ship within clear sight, only about 12 miles away from the Titanic, called the Californian. But unfortunately, she only had one radio operator, and her radio operator had gone to bed for the night. So she wasn't coming to Titanic's aid, whereas had she done so, she could have reached Titanic before Titanic sank.
Gentlemen, your attention, please. Step this way, please. That's right. Come towards me. Thank you. Good. For the time being, I shall require only women and children. Gentlemen,
right here.
please.
All right, boys, like the captain said, nice and cheery, so there's no panic.
Gentlemen, please. Stay exactly.
Wedding dance.
And here's the band playing. They played lively music to distract people from the sort of horrors of what was actually happening. So it was kind of comedy music they were playing and light-hearted music. And here's interesting, this is the third class locked below. But in fact, they had to be locked below to stop the spread of infectious diseases. But you were allowed to open the gates when there was a state of emergency. And what the film portrays quite wrongly here is it portrays that there's been the accident and then they're stuck below. But in fact, as soon as the order was given to lower away and to evacuate ship, those gates were opened. The reason for the myths about third class being locked below is that it took them 47 minutes between collision and giving the order to abandon ship. So because it was such a long time between the accident and realising the seriousness of the accident, that's why the gates remained closed. But as soon as the accident's severity was known, then stewards from both first and second class were sent down to third class to invite passengers up. And then Titanic tries to Morse lamp signal to the nearby Californian, but it appears that the two ships are burning oil lamps and that actually they don't realise they're Morse lamp signals. Unfortunately, the very still, cold air between the two ships actually just scrambled the sense out of the Morse lamp signals. So then Titanic resorts to her last resort, which is rockets. But unfortunately, the rockets exploding high up in the warmer air were actually at their true distance away, which was so far away, about 12 miles, they couldn't really be distinguished from the stars. But as they fell towards the sea on little parachutes, it was then that they could be seen by the nearby Californian, magnified in the colder air near the sea surface. So they looked like low-lying sort of fireworks on the deck or something. Or maybe the Californian, some of them thought that maybe there was a ship beyond what they were looking at that was actually firing rockets. So enormous confusion caused by the extraordinary atmospheric conditions that night.
Now there's something you don't see every day.
You can see here how calm the water is. It was so calm they had trouble releasing the lifeboats. They had to cut the ropes of the lifeboats because there was no rise and fall in the water as there would normally be with the waves. And the reason why the sea was so calm is because it was like a mill pond, because the next morning they counted about 200 icebergs all around the area where Titanic sank, and 25 of them were more than 200 feet high. So if you like, there was this kind of wall of ice, and the sea really was just a lake, a calm mill pond of mostly fresh water, which is why it's so calm.
Stay back!
Too late.
There are more boats down the front. Stay with this one, Murdoch. He seems to be quite practical.
And Murdoch actually was loading the boats on the right-hand side of Titanic, and he allowed men to go in those when there were no more women. But Lightoller on the other side of the ship absolutely allowed no men at all, women and children only. And in 1912, you were a man if you were over 13. So the third class were often travelling as families, and unfortunately, they didn't want to split up. So third class with, say, a 13-year-old son, 14-year-old son, 15, 16, 17, they were not about to leave those basically children on the ship. So that is why the third class families elected to stay on Titanic.
Stay back! Will you give us a chance to live, you limey bastard? I'll shoot any man who tries to get past me, get back! Bastard!
So this is Murdoch here threatening to shoot passengers. This is absolutely true. The officers were handed out revolvers to keep things calm. They shot into the air, they shot down the side of the ship. But it is reported that Murdoch did, in the end, shoot someone who was rushing one of the lifeboats, trying to run into one of the lifeboats. And the reason he did this is because the officers were worried that the ropes of the lifeboats were not strong enough to take the lifeboats fully laden from the deck. In fact, it was later found out that they were, in fact, designed to do that, but the officers didn't trust that. And they felt that this person rushing the boat might cause them all to die. So to save the whole lifeboat, he shot this person. And then, rather sadly, sort of gave a salute and committed suicide by shooting himself in the head as well, straight afterwards. And that is quite a well-documented fact. In reality, the scenes on the deck were quite calm until the last lifeboats were being launched.
Wait! Mr. Andrews!
So there's Thomas Andrews looking at a painting of Plymouth Harbour in the smoking room of Titanic. In fact, in reality, he was working really hard throwing deck chairs off the ship so that swimmers would be able to hang on to the deck chairs. So I don't actually think it was true that he was just chilling out there, but the painting is correct.
Mr. Guggenheim. These are for you, Mr. Guggenheim.
No, thank you. We are dressed in our best.
This person is based on Benjamin Guggenheim, one of the wealthiest people in the world at the time, and it's true that he did dress in his best. And there's Captain Smith watching the water rising up the stairs. A number of the officers did that. And here there's a woman who is just helplessly saying to the captain, "Can you take my baby? You know, what can you do?" And there is a rumour that he did save a baby from the wreck and swam to an upturned lifeboat, but then succumbed to the cold. And here he is walking into the bridge. It's a wonderfully dramatic scene where as the Titanic goes under, the sort of pressure forces the water in through the windows. In fact, that's not quite how it happened, and eyewitness reports show Captain Smith remaining calm to the end and actually taking a header dive off the bow as the water came up, and then swimming around in the water to try and help people and try and get to the lifeboats. The musicians played until the last lifeboats left, but in fact, after the last lifeboats left, they went down to their cabins, got their things, strapped them to their backs, took their socks and shoes off, and jumped into the water. And in fact, the bodies of the musicians, some of them, Wallace Hartley, for example, there, you see the band leader, his body was recovered and that violin was recovered, and it was sold in Devizes, which is a little town in England, in the West Country. It was sold for £1 million about 5 years ago, that exact violin. And this is Isidore and Ida Strauss. They founded Macy's department store, and it's true that they decided not to get into lifeboats.
And so they lived.
The Goodwin family, they all died. There were 8 of them, and 50 children died on the Titanic, which is an extremely sad fact. It's true that some artworks were lost on the Titanic. One was a jewelled copy of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, worth today many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of pounds. Here we have the first funnel falling down on a lot of helpless swimmers, and very sadly this is exactly what happened. The rope snapped that held up the funnel, but in fact, just as the film shows here, it washed collapsible B clear of the ship, and a number of people were saved by standing on the upturned bottom of that boat. Somehow the engineers managed to keep Titanic's lights burning, even when the ship was filling with water. In fact, one person looked at the squash court on the Titanic as it was sinking, and the lights could be seen burning under the green water of the North Atlantic. You can see the propellers rising out of the water there, and some of the survivors who were in lifeboats did record seeing that. And the passengers are all making their way to the stern. Most people who died on Titanic did die on the stern because the bow flooded so slowly they were all able to move to the back.
God Almighty.
Now here's the point where the lights go out, and that's because Titanic is starting to tear herself apart. Basically the heavy bow full of water is pulling against the stern, which is full of air, if you like, and very buoyant. So the ship is being ripped apart between what we call the superstructure and then the keel. And even though the keel is inch-thick steel, it's just being pulled apart almost like cotton because of the forces here. Now this is one of the most iconic scenes in the film, with Titanic ablaze, with her stern high in the air. And I have to disappoint some viewers by saying that that's actually not true. Titanic, in fact, broke her back at a 15-degree angle. So that is quite a shallow angle. And it's simply because the Titanic didn't have the strength to hold her stern up at that sort of height. So as soon as it got a bit above what it was designed to do, then it broke apart at about 15 degrees. And people heard the boilers rolling down through the ship. They heard the sort of bulkheads breaking down. They heard the steel being pulled apart. Now this is absolutely true here. This is Jack, who's based on a real life character called Jack Thayer. So Jack Dawson is in fact Jack Thayer, if you like. And he's an amalgam of real people, because here climbing over the stern is a bit like a baker called Baker Jocelyn. And he actually climbed over the stern just like Jack and Rose here. And in fact, he swam away without getting his head wet, which shows you in real life how calmly and quietly the stern did in fact disappear. Not at all in this sort of rush like this, but nevertheless, I don't wish to criticise this part of the film because it does communicate the horror. And the people here falling in clusters, some of the passengers regarded them as falling like clumps of bees, if you like, falling from a tree or something. And this is very accurately what happened. It was utterly horrific, and the film does portray the horror of it very accurately. Here's our baker. He in fact adjusted, he had some oranges in a pocket, and he adjusted his pockets like that and then just swam off. And he was one of the few people who survived the sinking of the Titanic whilst being in the water. And he did that because he held on to a lifeboat, so he wasn't fully submerged. And he survived allegedly for about 2 hours before they pulled him into the lifeboat. He had been drinking quite a lot, to be fair. He got pretty drunk. As Titanic was sinking, he went down to the pantry and stole all the alcohol he could find. And so maybe the fact that he was so drunk actually helped him. Who knows? The water was actually below freezing, it was actually -2. So people actually on the Titanic didn't generally tend to drown. They actually died of hypothermia and exposure, and they went unconscious within about 20 minutes in the water. In fact, with modern life-saving techniques, one nowadays, if one had got on the scene in time, could actually have very gently and slowly warmed them up and perhaps saved more people. But of course, they didn't have that technology in 1912, and there was not enough people on the scene, not enough rescue people on the scene, not quickly enough. So these are 1,500 poor souls struggling and fighting in the water. The ugly reality of the Titanic is that we're all programmed to survive, and in fact, men were drowning women without realizing it by grabbing onto them, and even people were pushing away their own family and things like that. So this is extremely accurate and extremely tragic. Most people who got wet when the Titanic sank did not survive because the water was actually -2. They mostly went unconscious after they were either drowned by fellow passengers trying to save themselves, or injured in the sinking, or just died of hypothermia and exposure by going unconscious after 20 minutes. The very few people who did survive, who did get wet, were rescued from flotsam, as we call it, which means planks of wood and things like that. In fact, a Japanese man was rescued from a staircase. He was found, picked up by a lifeboat from a staircase. And here we have Jack and Rose climbing onto a piece of woodwork. That's very realistic. There were pieces of woodwork floating about. And it is true that only by Rose staying out of the water could she have survived and then been picked up by this lifeboat. So that's actually very accurate. People joke and say, why didn't Jack get on the door as well? You know, there's plenty of room on the door. But actually, there probably wasn't. If he'd got on the door as well, their weight would have put them both deeper in the water, and neither of them survived. So he's allowing her to survive by being higher out of the water. And then an officer here is blowing his whistle. That's true, the officers did have whistles, and they used them to attract other lifeboats.
If we go back, they'll swamp the boat. They'll pull us right down, I'm telling you.
Knock it off. You're scaring me. Come on, girls. Grab an oar, let's go.
Are you out of your mind? We're in the middle of the North Atlantic. Now, do you people want to live or do you want to die?
Now, unfortunately, the lifeboats did not come back as a rule. So even the lifeboat that we see coming now to rescue them, it waited until all the cries had died down, because they believed that if they went back too soon, they would be swamped and all of the survivors on the lifeboats would have then drowned. So they wanted to wait until there weren't many swimmers. And then, even then, they didn't risk taking surviving passengers into the wreck to collect swimmers. So what they did is they actually transshipped passengers from one of the more empty lifeboats into one of the more full lifeboats, and then they went back with an empty lifeboat. And I think that way they saved several people, but most of them died in the lifeboat because they were wet. But I think about 5 of those people were saved. So in fact, only about 5 people were rescued by a normal floating lifeboat from the wreckage, and 1,500 people drowned. The other thing was that at night, with the Titanic gone, it's actually very hard to tell the direction of sound at night. So they wouldn't actually have known, without Titanic there, they wouldn't actually have known where to paddle. And the other thing is that they had rowed, all of them, very far from the ship in a sort of panic about the suction. And they had rowed, say, for an hour away from the ship, so that when it sank, even if they turned around straight away and started rowing back towards what they thought was the wreck site, it would have taken them a long time to actually get back to the wreck side. And the other thing is that Captain Smith had actually ordered the lifeboats to row towards the nearby Californian, which they could still see from the lifeboats. So a lot of the lifeboats were just heading off towards the safety of that ship. In fact, the passengers were very worried because even in the lifeboats, you weren't safe. You were on the North Atlantic. Many people in 1912 couldn't swim. And actually, as the sun came up the next morning, about 8:30, or by about 8:30, the sea began to rise and come up. And some of the lifeboats started to get swamped. And it's an interesting fact that had Carpathia not rescued everyone by 8:30 in the morning, as she did, that there may have been no survivors from the Titanic had she arrived, say, 2 hours later. And then she would have been like the Mary Celeste, and no one would ever know what happened to the biggest ship in the world. I do give the movie 10 out of 10, largely because the recreation of the scenes of Titanic are so accurate. If I did have any complaints, it would be that, in my view, the truth is stranger than fiction. And in fact, there are a lot of facts that are missed out in the film. Most notably, there was a potential rescue ship only about 10 miles away from Titanic during the whole time she sank. And that isn't mentioned in the film at all. But overall, the film gives a really good idea of what happened on that incredible night. And of course, it brings Titanic to a whole new audience of millions of people and keeps the memories alive. I hope you enjoyed that deep dive into what really happened the night the Titanic sank. Please give us a like, please subscribe, and if you have any other questions, contact History Hit and we'll be happy to answer them.